"Hey, you! You can't sit there! Get away from here!" This was an all-too-common sentence shouted during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Civil rights leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. showed the people of the world what it was like to be a Black American through their speeches and writings. Nonviolence and persuasive writings were an effective means of protest during the civil rights movement. From Rosa Parks' quiet refusal to move from her bus seat in 1955 to Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail in 1963, nonviolence and persuasive writings and speeches brought the civil rights movement into every home in America and to media around the world. As America was making leaps and bounds in business and technology following World War II, basic human rights were being ignored across the country. Schools, stores, and transportation were heavily segregated simply due to the color of one's skin. A core group of writers and activists began making strides and headlines in their quest to make all people free and equal. In 1955, Rosa Parks was on her way home from work in Montgomery, Alabama, and she was tired. She sat in the open seat on the bus, and the rest, as they say, is history. The next day, the Black community had called for action, now known as the Montgomery Bus Boycott. For the 381 days from December 1, 1955 to December 20, 1956, Black Americans in the Montgomery area found other means of transportation while the case of Browder versus Gale played out in court. In December of 1956, the U.S. Supreme Court declared that laws enforcing segregated buses were unconstitutional and therefore unenforceable. The bus system was to be immediately desegregated. Peaceful protest and nonviolence had won. Through the next 9 years, the civil rights movement was in full swing. It was a critical time for Black Americans to make their voices heard. A largely written about and even televised event happening in 1965 was the fight for voters' rights. Up to this point, only white Americans were allowed the vote. In January 1965, protests began in Selma, Alabama, when Black voters found themselves blocked from their right to register to vote. Over the next 3 months, Alabama and the country would find themselves in turmoil. Sunday, March 7, is a date that shall forever be remembered as Bloody Sunday. Civil rights activists in Selma, led by John Lewis and the Reverend Hosea Williams, had staged a peaceful march for voting access and were met with violence by local authorities. At the end of the conflict, 67 marchers were injured, and the world watched in horror. When President Johnson saw the Bloody Sunday protests play out on television, he knew he had to act. He presented the Voting Rights Act before Congress and gave an impassioned speech on March 15th. In a unique move, President Johnson had his presentation carried on television, watched around the world. C.T. Vivian, an SCLS activist, was with Dr. King watching the speech. I looked over, and Martin was very quietly sitting in the chair, and a tear ran down his cheek. It was a victory like none other. It was an affirmation of the movement. On Thursday, March 25th, a group that had swelled from 300 to over 25,000 over the 3-day march from Selma to Montgomery arrived at the Capitol building of Alabama. There, on the steps, Dr. King delivered his now famous "How long, not long" speech. At its conclusion, the group approached the doors of the building with their petition. They made peaceful contact with a staff person, and the petition was delivered. On August 6, 1965, President Johnson's Voting Rights Act was passed into law. From that day forward, all people, regardless of color, had equal right to vote. Through the long struggle, persuasion and peaceful protest had won in the end. The 1950s and 60s were a turbulent time for America. The world was changing, and human rights and equality needed to change with it. Through the tools of literature, many voices became as one. With the widening reach of television and radio, all people had access to the songs and stories of the day. No longer limited to paper alone, messages could be passed through folk song, beat poetry, persuasive speeches in person and broadcast, and the music of clubs across the nation. These persuasive and nonviolent voices called for change, and change was made.